My name is Julia Thompson, and what I'm about to share is something I never thought I'd experience. I was a history teacher, a wife, a mother of 2 grown children, and by most standards, my life was steady, predictable, safe. But underneath the routines, the smiles, the neatly graded papers on my desk, there was always a whisper, a feeling that something was off. For years, I ignored it. I had built a life filled with order, logic, and facts. My job was to teach history as it was written, as it had been passed down. And yet, deep inside, I wondered if we were missing something, if there were truths left untold. That morning started like any other. My alarm buzzed at 5:45 a.m., pulling me from a restless sleep. My husband, David, was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, scrolling through the morning news on his tablet. "You were tossing and turning all night," he murmured, barely looking up. I forced a smile, brushing it off. Just thinking about today's lesson. I didn't tell him about the strange heaviness in my chest, the unease that had lingered since I woke up. By 7:30 a.m., I was on my way to Lincoln High School, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The school was already alive with the hum of students, the clatter of lockers, the casual laughter of teenagers who had no idea how fleeting their innocence was. I walked into my classroom, set down my bag, and took a deep breath. Today, I was teaching about the civil rights movement, a subject I cared deeply about. I believed in truth, in justice, in giving my students a complete picture of the past. But as I wrote Martin Luther King Jr. on the whiteboard, that whisper returned, louder this time. What if the history you teach isn't the whole truth? By the time second period rolled around, my classroom was full of restless energy. My students were half engaged, some taking notes, others doodling in the margins of their notebooks. I was in the middle of a discussion about the March on Washington when it happened. A sharp, searing pain ripped through my chest. At first, it felt like a cramp, a tight squeeze that I could shake off. But within seconds, it became unbearable, a crushing weight, like an iron fist closing around my heart. My vision blurred, dark spots creeping in at the edges. I reached for the desk, trying to steady myself. "Mrs. Thompson?" One of my students, Olivia, furrowed her brow, concern flashing in her young eyes. I opened my mouth to reassure her, but no words came out. My throat locked, my breath shallow and ragged. The room tilted. My knees buckled. Gasps filled the classroom. Someone screamed. A chair scraped against the floor as students jumped up. I barely registered the chaos around me, the sound of footsteps rushing toward me, desks being shoved aside. My body no longer felt like my own. My hands trembled, my limbs tingled, then went numb. My heart pounded violently, then suddenly, slowed. This isn't happening. But it was. I could hear my name being called, but the voices sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from the other side of a thick wall. Am I dying? A cold wave of fear surged through me. I wanted to fight, to hold on, but something was pulling me away. My head hit the ground, and for a split second, the world went silent. Then, nothing. No pain. No sound. No body. Just an eerie, weightless stillness. I should have panicked. I should have been terrified. But instead, as my vision dimmed to black, a single, chilling thought whispered through my mind. So this is how it ends. I was floating. Not in water, not through air, but weightless in a way I couldn't comprehend. The pain in my chest was gone, the crushing weight lifted. Yet, a new fear took its place, something primal, something that told me I wasn't supposed to be here, wherever here was. Below me, I saw my classroom. My students were in chaos. Olivia was kneeling beside my body, shaking my shoulder, tears streaking down her face. Another student, Jason, had his phone pressed to his ear, shouting frantically, "We need an ambulance." She's not moving. I saw it all, saw me lying lifeless on the cold linoleum floor, my face pale, my lips parted as if caught mid-sentence. My arms lay limp at my sides, my wedding ring glinting under the fluorescent lights. "No," I whispered, though I had no voice. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." Panic surged through me. I tried to move, to reach out, to scream. But I had no hands. No mouth. No body. I was there, yet I wasn't. The room blurred, the sounds of students crying and the distant wail of approaching sirens warping into a dull hum. My consciousness felt like it was stretching, unraveling. I was being pulled, no, drawn, towards something beyond the walls of my classroom, beyond anything I had ever known. I fought against it. I wasn't ready. I have a family, a husband, children who still need me. But the pull was relentless. It wasn't violent, nor was it forceful. It was gentle, like an invisible hand guiding me away from the world I had known. A warmth settled over me, strange yet familiar, as if I were sinking into something far greater than myself. For the first time, a new thought emerged, cutting through the panic. What if I'm not dying? What if I'm already dead? The second I thought it, something inside me shifted. The fear lessened, just enough for me to realize that I was no longer bound to the rules of the life I had left behind. And that was when the world around me began to change. I tried to move, but there was no moving in the way I had always understood. Instead, I drifted, untethered, as if I were part of the space itself. My panic from before still simmered beneath the surface, but a strange calm was beginning to take hold, spreading through me like a slow, steady current. Is this death? I thought. Is this what happens after everything just stops? Then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. Not just a glow, not just an ordinary brightness. It was alive, pulsating, radiating something more than light, something I felt rather than saw. It called to me, not with words, but with an unspoken knowing. I wasn't afraid of it. I should have been terrified, I had just died. But standing here, or floating, or being, staring at this impossible radiance, the fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen. It was as if the warmth of the light was reaching out, wrapping around me, pulling me forward. I didn't walk toward it. I didn't have legs anymore. I simply moved, drawn by something beyond my control. As I got closer, the silence around me deepened, but not in a way that felt empty. It was rich, full, like a moment pregnant with meaning. And then, I felt it, something so vast, so powerful, it made every part of me tremble. I knew this presence. I had heard his name my whole life. I had seen paintings of him in churches, heard sermons about him, whispered prayers in desperate moments when I wasn't even sure anyone was listening. But now, I knew. This wasn't just light. It was him. Jesus. He wasn't a distant figure in history. He wasn't just a symbol or a story passed down through generations. He was here. And he was waiting for me. I should have been overwhelmed, undone by the sheer magnitude of his presence. But instead, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had come home. I stood at the edge of time itself, watching history unravel before me. I wasn't merely observing, I was inside it. Every moment stretched before me like an open book, yet I could feel it, live it, as though I belonged to each second that passed. And then, I saw them. The shore was wide, the sand hot beneath the bare feet of the people who stood there. Their skin glistened under the merciless sun, their wrists bound in rusted chains. I could hear their cries, raw and broken, as the waves crashed against the wooden hulls of waiting ships. I knew this place. The transatlantic slave trade. I wanted to turn away, to deny what I was seeing, but I couldn't. Jesus was beside me, his presence both gentle and unyielding. Look, he told me, his voice not spoken, but felt deep within my being. You must see. So I watched. I watched as men, women, and children were ripped from their homes, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. I saw them shoved onto ships, their bodies crammed together like cargo. I heard their prayers, some whispered, some screamed, calling out for mercy, for deliverance. My chest ached, my soul wrenched with sorrow. Why? I finally choked out. Why are you showing me this? Jesus turned to me, his eyes deep with something I couldn't name. Grief? Love? Both? Because what they took from them, he said, was not just their freedom. They stole their legacy. Their divine calling. I felt my breath hitch. Their calling? He nodded. They were chosen for something greater. But the world rewrote their story. Their suffering became their identity, but it was never meant to be that way. Tears burned my eyes as I watched the years stretch on. The chains of metal turned to chains of laws, chains of injustice, chains of silence. I saw their songs change from cries of anguish to whispers of defiance, their prayers never ceasing, even when the world told them their God had abandoned them. But he never had. Their faith was never broken, Jesus said. Even when everything else was taken, their spirit endured. Their prayers have never stopped rising. I could feel those prayers now, swirling around me, thick and powerful. They weren't echoes of the past, they were alive. A force moving through time, through generations, through me. I clenched my fists, my body shaking. They never knew, I whispered. They never knew what they were meant for. Jesus nodded. Because it was hidden from them. Buried beneath history rewritten by those who feared the truth. Rage, sorrow, regret, it all crashed over me at once. I had spent my life teaching history, believing in the truth of what I had read, what I had been told. But now I saw it for what it was. Incomplete. Manipulated. Lies, woven so tightly into the fabric of reality that even those who lived through it had forgotten their own power. I turned to Jesus, my voice barely a whisper. Can it be restored? His answer was simple. It is already happening. The air around me shifted, and suddenly, I was moving again, not walking, not floating, but being placed into another moment in time. The sound of rustling fields filled my ears, the scent of earth thick and heavy. I was standing in the middle of a cotton plantation, the sun hanging low in the sky, its golden light barely touching the backs of the men and women working in endless rows. Their hands were calloused, their bodies thin from exhaustion, but it was their eyes that struck me the most. Hollow. Silent. They didn't speak, but their souls screamed. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening with sorrow. I had taught this part of history before, the cruelty, the inhumanity, but I had never felt it like this. Then, something happened. A low hum rose from the fields, barely more than a whisper at first. Then another voice joined. And another. A melody, ancient and full of longing, swelled through the air. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I shuddered. The sound was both haunting and powerful, filled with something deeper than pain, something unbreakable. Do you hear them? Jesus asked, standing beside me. I nodded, unable to speak. They were never singing just for survival, he continued. They were sending messages. Not only to each other, but to heaven. The truth of his words wrapped around me, suffocating. These weren't just songs. They were prayers. Codes woven into melodies, passed down like whispered secrets. Every note, every syllable carried the weight of 1,000 souls, crying out for deliverance. And heaven listened, Jesus said. I felt something shift inside me, a deep, painful realization. For so long, history had painted these people as victims, as suffering souls waiting for freedom to be given to them. But that wasn't the truth at all. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting, resisting, believing. Their faith had never been broken. Even in the face of unthinkable cruelty, they had known they were meant for something more. They stole their bodies, I whispered, but they could never steal their souls. Jesus nodded. And the prayers of their ancestors never faded. They still echo through time, covering their children, their grandchildren, and generations beyond. Their faith became their shield, their inheritance, a power greater than any man-made chains. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed. Then why? My voice cracked. Why does the world still see them as broken? Why have they forgotten? Jesus turned to me, his expression heavy with sorrow. Because the ones in power made sure they would. The weight of his words crushed me. I had spent my life teaching history, yet I had never truly seen it. The deception, the manipulation, it had all been carefully crafted to bury the truth. To erase their strength. To make them forget the divine inheritance they carried in their very blood. Tears slipped down my face. How do we undo this? I asked, desperation lacing my voice. Jesus reached out, and suddenly, I felt it, millions of voices, past and present, rising as one. A force, a movement, something awakening. You don't undo it, he said. You remember. The vision shifted again. The fields, the voices, the songs, they faded into darkness, dissolving into something colder, heavier. I was no longer standing in the past. I was somewhere else. Somewhere modern, yet just as suffocating. A dimly lit room stretched before me, lined with towering bookshelves and long mahogany tables. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and polished wood, but something about it felt wrong. Then, I saw them. Men in dark suits sat around the table, their faces obscured by the shadows cast from the low-hanging lamps above. Their voices were hushed, their tones deliberate. I stepped forward, instinctively reaching for something, anything, that could make sense of what I was witnessing. Who are they? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jesus stood beside me, his presence unwavering. They are the ones who rewrote history. The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I listened, straining to hear their whispers. Too much knowledge would be dangerous. They must never understand what they once were. Control the narrative, and you control the people. A sickening realization settled in my gut. These men weren't debating laws or policies. They weren't planning for justice or equality. They were ensuring that the truth never came to light. My knees felt weak. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. They knew? They always knew? His expression was sorrowful. They have always known. My breath caught in my throat. I had spent years teaching history, believing that the gaps in our knowledge were accidents, oversights. But now, I saw the truth. The omissions were intentional. The erasure was deliberate. They took more than their freedom, I whispered, the horror sinking deeper into my bones. They stole their identity. Jesus nodded. And in doing so, they stole their power. I wanted to scream. To rage. To demand why. Why had no one stopped this? Why had no one fought to keep the truth alive? But then, another voice echoed through the room, one of the men at the table, his voice eerily calm. If they ever remember, if they ever reclaim what was taken, we will lose control. A chill ran through me. This wasn't just about history. This was about power. About keeping an entire people from realizing their divine inheritance. I clenched my fists, anger rising in my chest. And no one fought back? Jesus looked at me, his gaze steady. Many fought. Many paid the price for speaking. But the ones in power were relentless. They used fear. They used deception. And over time, the truth became a myth. Tears burned my eyes. But the prayers never stopped, I murmured. No, he said softly. And that is why the chains are breaking. A warmth spread through me, a flicker of hope in the midst of my sorrow. The truth had been buried, but it had never been destroyed. And now, it was rising. The room of men, the whispered schemes, the weight of centuries of deception, it all dissolved before my eyes. The darkness around me lifted, and suddenly, I was somewhere new. A city street stretched before me, familiar yet different. The buildings were ones I recognized: coffee shops, grocery stores, churches, schools. People bustled about, going through the motions of their daily lives. But as I looked closer, I realized I wasn't just seeing them. I was feeling them. Their burdens. Their exhaustion. Their silent, unspoken grief. I saw a young mother hurrying down the sidewalk, her toddler clinging to her hand. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes scanning the street like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. A man sat on a park bench, his hands clasped together, staring at the ground. He looked lost, like a soul wandering without direction. Teenagers walked past, laughing loudly, but beneath their bravado, I felt their uncertainty, their longing for something real. "They don't know," I murmured. Jesus stood beside me, his presence radiating both sorrow and love. "No. But their souls remember." I turned to him, my heart aching. "Then why don't they feel it? Why don't they know what they carry?" His eyes met mine, steady and unshaken. "Because everything has been done to keep them from knowing." I felt my chest tighten. It was so much bigger than I had ever understood. The deception wasn't just in history books or erased documents, it was woven into everyday life. Into distractions. Into struggles. Into a world that had conditioned them to forget. "But look again," Jesus said. I turned back to the street, and this time I saw. In the cracks of pain, in the spaces between doubt and exhaustion, something was shifting. A man passing by a storefront slowed, his gaze lifting toward the sky as if sensing something just beyond his reach. A woman clutched her chest for a brief second, her breath hitching, before shaking her head as if dismissing the sudden wave of emotion. A child, no older than 5, stood still in the middle of the sidewalk, looking up, eyes wide, as if listening to something no one else could hear. "The awakening has begun," Jesus whispered. I felt it then, a pulse, a tremor, a force stirring beneath the surface of reality. It was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. "Some will feel it before others," Jesus continued. "Some will resist it. Some will be afraid." A wave of sadness washed over me. I knew what he meant. Many would reject this truth, conditioned to believe the lies. Some would fight against it, not because they didn't believe, but because fear had been their foundation for too long. What if they never remember? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jesus' response was calm, certain. They will. The time of deception is ending. The truth is rising. Tears blurred my vision. This was bigger than history. Bigger than oppression. This was about identity. About a people rediscovering who they had always been. I looked at Jesus, my voice trembling. "And what happens when they do?" He smiled, and in that smile, I saw everything. The world will change. My eyes flew open, my lungs heaving as if I had been drowning and had just broken the surface. My body convulsed, my fingers clutching at the sterile sheets beneath me. The fluorescent lights above burned into my retinas, too bright, too harsh, too real. And then, the words tore from my throat, raw and desperate, louder than I had ever spoken before. "Jesus is God." The room fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, all I could hear was the frantic beeping of machines, the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. Then, footsteps, hurried, urgent. A nurse gasped. A doctor rushed forward, his pen light flicking across my pupils. I barely registered him. I was here. I was back. But I was not the same. My chest ached, each breath a struggle. My limbs felt like lead, foreign and weak. But what overwhelmed me most was the unbearable weight of knowing. Of remembering. I turned my head slightly, the movement slow and labored. My husband, David, was at my bedside, his face a mixture of shock and relief. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hand trembling as it gripped mine. "Julia?" His voice cracked. "Oh my God, you're awake." I swallowed hard, my throat raw. Tears burned my eyes, but they weren't from fear. They weren't from pain. I had seen. I had stood before him. And now, I was back in a world that suddenly felt smaller. Thinner. Like a veil had been lifted, and I could still see beyond it. The doctor cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, you were clinically dead for 9 minutes. We managed to revive you, but... I barely heard him. 9 minutes? How could I explain that I had been gone for more than time itself could measure? That I had seen history unfold, watched centuries pass in the blink of an eye? That I had stood in the presence of the Almighty, that his voice still echoed in the marrow of my bones? David squeezed my hand tighter. Julia, do you remember what happened? I exhaled shakily, my body trembling from the sheer force of what I had experienced. My lips parted, but how could I begin? How could I reduce eternity into words? Tears slipped down my cheeks. I turned my head to look at him, my voice hoarse but unwavering. I died, David. My fingers tightened around his. And Jesus sent me back. His expression shifted, relief morphing into something else. Something cautious. The doctor exchanged glances with the nurse. Mrs. Thompson, near-death experiences can be disorienting. Sometimes the brain. I shook my head weakly. No. My voice was firmer now. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some illusion. I felt it again, that pulse, that tremor of awakening. And I knew. I had been sent back for a reason. I turned my gaze to the doctor, to the nurse, to my husband, my chest rising and falling with the weight of a truth I could no longer keep silent. The world has been lied to. My voice cracked, filled with something between sorrow and urgency. And I have to tell them the truth. The real challenge wasn't dying. It wasn't even standing before Jesus and witnessing the truth that had been buried for generations. No, the hardest part was telling people what I had seen, knowing that most of them would never believe me. At first, my family was gentle. They assumed I was still in shock, that the trauma of dying, of being gone, had left me confused, fragile. David was the worst. Not because he was cruel, but because he looked at me like I was slipping away from him in a way that even death hadn't managed to do. One evening, about a week after I was discharged from the hospital, we sat across from each other at the dinner table. I could barely touch my food. My hands trembled as I reached for my glass of water. David sighed, rubbing his temples. Julia, I need you to listen to me. I am listening, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked at me, tired and wary. You died, honey. That's real. But what you think you saw, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, might not be what you think it was. Anger flared in my chest. You think I imagined it? David shook his head. Not imagined. Just a response. The brain does things when it's shutting down. You know that. I pushed my plate aside, appetite gone. This wasn't a hallucination, David. I was there. I saw history unfold. I saw Jesus. His jaw tightened. You think you saw Jesus? Frustration boiled over. I know I did. And he showed me the truth. The world has been lied to, David. There is a divine inheritance that has been stolen, and... He exhaled sharply, pushing back from the table. Julia, stop. I froze. He ran a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. I don't know how to help you if you keep talking like this. The words stung. I had died, I had seen, and now, standing here in my own kitchen, in the life I had returned to, I felt more alone than I ever had before. But it wasn't just David. The first time I tried to tell my closest friend, she stared at me like I had grown a second head. Julia, I love you, but, do you hear yourself? I had hoped for understanding. Instead, I got polite skepticism. She listened, nodding in all the right places, but her eyes told me everything. She didn't believe me. And when I tried to tell my church, the reaction was worse. The pastor, a man I had trusted for years, leaned forward in his chair, hands clasped. "Julia, near-death experiences can feel very real. But you have to be careful. The enemy is deceptive." I nearly laughed. The enemy? I had stood before the Son of God. I had felt his love, seen the truth woven through time itself. This wasn't deception. The deception was what we had all been fed for generations. I left that meeting humiliated. Whispers followed me in the church hallways. People avoided eye contact. Some pitied me. Others dismissed me entirely. I wasn't just doubted. I was discarded. And yet, no matter how much they rejected me, I couldn't shake what I had seen. Late at night, when the house was quiet and David was asleep beside me, I would stare at the ceiling, the weight of my mission pressing down on me. "Tell them, before it is too late." Jesus' words echoed in my soul, urgent, unshakable. So, I did the only thing I knew to do. I wrote. I poured out everything, every vision, every word Jesus spoke to me, every moment I had spent beyond this world. I filled pages with the truth, knowing that even if people refused to listen, I had to try. At first, it was just a private journal. But then I started sharing pieces online. The reactions were immediate. Some mocked me. Some called me a liar, a fanatic, a woman who had lost her mind. But others heard me. The messages trickled in, quiet at first, then more and more. I don't know why, but something about your words feels familiar. Like I already knew this truth, but had forgotten it. I've had dreams like this. I never told anyone, but I always felt like there was something more, something they didn't want us to remember. You're not crazy. I felt it too. I clung to those messages like lifelines. Because the world may have been built on lies, but truth? Truth had a way of rising. And I would not stay silent. At first, I thought I was alone in this. Rejected by my church, dismissed by my husband, ridiculed by friends, I had never felt more isolated. But no matter how many doors were shut in my face, I couldn't stop. Because I had seen. Because Jesus had sent me back for a reason. So I kept writing. I shared my testimony anywhere I could, online forums, social media, even handwritten letters I left in church pews. I knew most people would dismiss me, but I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to the ones who were already waking up. And slowly, they found me. The first email came late one night, a simple message from a woman named Diane in Georgia. I don't know why I'm writing this, but I need to tell you, I've had dreams of Jesus calling me to remember something I never knew. Your words feel like a confirmation. Like I was meant to hear this. Then another. I grew up being told that our history was about survival. But after reading what you wrote, I realize, we weren't just surviving. We were chosen for something greater. Then more. Messages from strangers across the country, people of all backgrounds, all ages, all saying the same thing, this feels like truth. One day, a man named Michael called me. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a secret for far too long. I've been searching for this my whole life, he said. I felt it, deep in my bones. My grandmother used to tell me stories, how our people were meant for something divine, something stolen. But the church told her she was wrong. She stopped speaking about it before she died. I gripped the phone tighter. Michael, she wasn't wrong. Silence. Then a shaky exhale. I knew it, he whispered. I knew it. And that's when I realized, I wasn't just speaking into the void. The truth wasn't just being heard. It was remembered. I started traveling, meeting with small groups, people gathering in homes, in quiet coffee shops, in back rooms of churches that didn't belong to the institutions that had tried to silence them. These were people who had already felt the pull. One night, in a small gathering in Chicago, an elderly woman took my hands in hers, her eyes shining with something fierce. My mother used to tell me, she whispered, that one day, the voices of our ancestors would rise again. That we would remember what was taken. And child, her grip tightened, it's happening now. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Yes, I whispered. It is. The more I spoke, the more I saw it, people were waking up. They weren't just hearing the words, they were feeling them. And I knew then, with unshakable certainty, the truth was no longer buried. I never thought I would die and return. But I did. And what I saw changed everything. For 9 minutes, I was gone from this world. In that time, I stood before Jesus. Not as a distant figure from a storybook, not as a painting in a church, but as the living, undeniable presence of God. His light wasn't just around me, it was in me, filling every part of my soul with truth I had never known before. He showed me the hidden history, the prayers of generations that had never stopped rising, and the calling that so many of us have forgotten. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, I knew my life would never be the same. I had seen beyond the veil, beyond the lies we've been told, and I realized, faith is not just a belief. It's a remembrance of who we truly are. So I ask you this, what if you were in my place? What if you died, saw eternity, and came back knowing the world had been living in deception? How would you live differently? Jesus sent me back for a reason. And now, I share this message with you, the time of awakening is here. The truth is rising. If you feel something stirring inside you, if you believe in the power of prayer, write your prayer in the comments below, and I will pray for you. Like this video, subscribe, and share this message, because the world needs to remember before it's too late.